Right now, across social media and news networks, millions of people are asking the exact same question about the volatile Strait of Hormuz. They want to know why the United States Navy does not simply deploy its massive fleet to escort civilian tankers through the danger zone. The prevailing logic sounds incredibly bulletproof. When you listen to armchair generals and political commentators on television networks, they argue that we should just park a multi-billion-dollar Aegis destroyer right next to each massive supertanker to provide a shield. A modern U.S. Navy destroyer carries 96 vertical launch missile cells and the most advanced radar tracking systems on the planet. Those sensors can theoretically track a ballistic warhead in the exosphere, while simultaneously managing hundreds of local enemy targets. The naive conclusion is that if you deploy this floating fortress, the problem is immediately solved and the valuable crude flows again. But if you think the U.S. Navy is not escorting tankers because they are afraid of Iranian scuba divers, you are completely mistaken today. You have been watching far too many Hollywood action movies that romanticize naval combat and completely ignore the brutal laws of physics. The reality of this choke point is not about guys in wetsuits, swimming silently in the darkness with magnetic explosive-shaped charges. It is a terrifying mathematical equation of three-dimensional modern warfare and the unforgiving geographic reality of terrain masking. I will show you why putting a billion-dollar Arleigh Burke destroyer next to a civilian tanker actually increases the danger for everyone. We will strip away the politically correct answers and look at the brutal calculus of modern naval strategic area denial deterrence today. The shipping lane through the Strait of Hormuz is extremely narrow, and the incoming threats arrive from directions the ship cannot handle. If you think escorting is a simple geometry problem, where you just place a guard next to a target, this video will break that assumption. We will decode exactly why the most powerful warship in the world becomes a massive liability inside this incredibly narrow, hostile strait. You must pay close attention, because the physics and the mathematics of this hostile combat environment are about to get very uncomfortable. The U.S. Navy is not guessing about the effectiveness of escorts, because they already have a very bloody history in these dangerous waters. They have executed this precise mission before, and the permanent scars of that chaotic operation are still written in the official records. That mission was the largest American naval convoy operation since World War II, and it truly taught the military a devastating lesson. The painful lesson from that era was incredibly clear, because you absolutely do not solve an escort problem by simply adding more escorts. You only solve this massive tactical nightmare by removing the immediate threats and rethinking your entire approach to the battle space. To understand the true nightmare of this scenario, we must look closely at the incredibly vulnerable vessels we are supposedly protecting. A very large crude carrier, or VLCC, is the absolute backbone of global energy transit, and it is completely defenseless in a combat zone. These massive engineering marvels are thousands of feet long and significantly wider than an entire professional American football field. They are heavily loaded with over 2 million barrels of highly flammable crude oil, displacing an astonishing 300,000 tons. You must think about what that massive weight actually means for the maneuverability of a ship when it is suddenly under a military attack. A fully loaded supertanker requires a stopping distance that is literally measured in nautical miles rather than just hundreds of feet. At a full sea speed of roughly 15 knots, this massive ship needs several agonizing minutes just to initiate a basic course change. Moving at only 15 knots means the tanker travels at less than half the speed of the Arleigh Burke destroyer, sailing right beside it. Now we must examine the actual hull of the vessel, because a VLCC is strictly a commercial transport ship and not a military dreadnought. The external steel plating in some sections is as remarkably thin as half an inch, which is engineered purely for structural integrity. There is absolutely no combat armor, no blast-resistant compartmentalization, and zero damage control teams trained for incoming enemy fire. Just one anti-ship missile penetrating that fragile hull will detonate inside a steel container filled with highly flammable hydrocarbons. Some commentators want you to hyperventilate over the threat of covert divers planting magnetic limpet mines on these unarmored hulls. We must explicitly state that suicide swimmers and limpet mines are merely a psychological nuisance and definitely not a strategic threat. Modern anti-diver sonar systems handle this specific nuisance easily, making the Hollywood scenario of invisible frogmen totally obsolete. The undeniable truth is that the US Navy does not lose sleep over a few guys in wetsuits trying to swim against a violent tidal current. Imagine escorting an 18-wheel fuel truck through a narrow, dark alley with well-armed hostile snipers positioned on all the rooftops. You are driving an armored security vehicle alongside it, and while you can shoot back, you cannot physically block an incoming projectile. Your advanced combat armor protects your own vehicle, but it does absolutely nothing to protect the giant, slow-moving target you escort. Here is exactly where the Arleigh Burke destroyer, the absolute crown jewel of the surface fleet, begins to fail completely. It fails not because of any structural flaw in its engineering, but because the local geography strips away every advantage. The mighty Aegis destroyer carries the most capable air defense radar afloat, utilizing systems like the advanced SPY-1. On the open water, these powerful arrays provide a detection range exceeding 200 nautical miles against aerial targets. But you must fundamentally understand that radar is microwave energy, and it strictly travels in a straight, unwavering line. These electromagnetic beams cannot bend around massive mountains, nor can they magically curve over towering, jagged ridgelines. If a solid, massive object stands between the antenna and the target, the beam stops dead and carves a terrifying radar shadow. The narrow strait is not just a simple bottleneck, because the mountainous Iranian coastline provides perfect terrain masking. The sheer Zagros Mountains provide a dense physical shield, hiding mobile missile launchers from ship-based surface radar arrays. Place that exact same radar antenna inside a narrow strait lined with mountains, and every single cliff face blinds the system. The vast open ocean gives you an enormous amount of physical distance. And, in modern naval warfare, that distance equals time. The Strait of Hormuz, at its narrowest point, measures 21 nautical miles. But these ships do not have that much space. The strict traffic separation scheme confines all commercial vessel traffic, forcing them into a corridor just 6 miles wide. These giant unarmored tankers must travel single file inside a narrow ribbon of water, surrounded directly by sheer rock faces. Hostile forces have carefully positioned mobile transporter erector launchers, hiding them inside deep mountain tunnel complexes. These fortified tunnels are carved deeply through the dense mountains, sitting barely 5 nautical miles from the shipping lane. The advanced radar sensor is not broken or malfunctioning, but the restrictive geographic geometry simply broke its physics. A powerful ballistic missile launching from these concealed positions does not fly in a straight line from launcher to target. It aggressively arcs upward and then rapidly drops at a steep terminal angle, completing its flight path in under 1 minute. But the crucial metric in this scenario is not the total flight time, because the only time that truly matters is detection time. Terrain masking is the real weapon here, because the mountains completely block the destroyer radar line of sight to the launcher. The surface radar simply does not see the incoming deadly missile until the weapon physically clears the towering ridgeline. Even if the defensive system achieves a lock instantaneously, the interceptor needs critical seconds to reach the engagement point. By the time a coastal cruise missile enters its terminal phase and activates its own seeker, an escorting destroyer has seconds to react. A subsonic cruise missile flying low and hugging the wave tops presents another terrifying geometric problem from a different angle. Inside the confined strait, with terrain reflections masking the rapid approach, the detection range collapses to 5 nautical miles. The harsh lesson from modern combat is that escorting is a fundamentally flawed World War II concept that guarantees heavy losses. You simply do not solve a complicated surface problem with extremely vulnerable surface ships trapped inside a geographical canyon. The US Navy must dominate the 3D battle space using AWACS and high-altitude drones to look directly over those treacherous mountains. In an era of anti-ship ballistic missiles and advanced coastal cruise missiles, the only viable naval defense must be entirely offensive. To hit a moving ship with a ballistic missile, the enemy desperately needs continuous eyes on target to complete the lethal kill chain. The US military disrupts this entire process by aggressively blinding their coastal radar systems, rather than just playing goalie. Modern maritime warfare strongly dictates neutralizing the mobile threat at its origin, before a single missile leaves the launch pad. The geometry designed to give Aegis a massive advantage in open water becomes a deadly liability, demanding a radical change in strategy. Now we must completely shift our focus to the macroeconomic reality, because the geopolitical map reveals a shocking and brutal truth. The traditional narrative insists that protecting this volatile choke point is absolutely essential for the survival of the US economy. However, if you carefully examine the modern global energy transit routes, you will uncover a significantly different geopolitical picture. The vast majority of this vital crude oil flowing through the narrow strait is currently destined to directly feed China and Western Europe. The undeniable macroeconomic fact is that massive US domestic energy production has made America largely independent from this foreign oil. This massive tectonic shift in global energy dynamics perfectly justifies the exact reason why Washington remains so incredibly hesitant. The American government absolutely will not risk its powerful naval fleet here, simply because the nation no longer desperately needs it. The hostile regime occupying the coast is not trying to win a conventional naval battle against the overwhelmingly superior American forces. Their entire military doctrine is brilliantly built around the asymmetric concept of strategic area denial deterrence in this narrow space. Their primary goal is intentionally making the water so risky that soaring global insurance premiums alone will shut down the entire strait. By leveraging the threat of coastal missiles, they can effectively cripple the maritime economy without ever fighting a massive fleet battle. Therefore, we must critically ask why the US military should ever risk the precious lives of its sailors in this highly toxic environment. Placing a multi-billion-dollar Arleigh Burke asset in extreme jeopardy just to secure a distant foreign shipping lane is completely illogical. The United States Navy carefully looks at this terrifying Escort equation and calculates the devastating potential cost of a single mistake. It makes absolutely zero sense for the American taxpayers to heavily subsidize the maritime security of nations that refuse to participate. If an unarmored supertanker carrying million barrels of crude oil is suddenly destroyed, the resulting crisis primarily hurts foreign markets. The US consumer might experience a temporary fluctuation in prices, but the European and Asian economies would face an immediate catastrophe. The physics of the narrow strait made direct naval escort missions incredibly dangerous, while the new economics make it totally unnecessary. The United States military did not build the most advanced surface fleet in history, merely to serve as unpaid bodyguards for global trade. You do not solve this complex geopolitical puzzle by deploying vulnerable defensive assets inside a geographical canyon of certain destruction. You solve it by forcing the actual beneficiaries of this foreign oil to finally step up and heavily invest in their own maritime protection. This brutal calculus of modern warfare shows that undertaking this massive global responsibility offers absolutely zero strategic upside for us. The undeniable truth is that the extreme physical vulnerability of these commercial vessels fundamentally changes the entire strategic equation. A single successful strike against one of these massive targets would instantly trigger an unprecedented global environmental disaster today. The massive volume of toxic crude oil spilling into the confined waters would permanently destroy the delicate regional marine ecosystem now. Dealing with the horrific aftermath of such a massive catastrophe would consume vast amounts of international resources and political capital. This incredibly bleak scenario further reinforces the crucial argument against positioning military assets inside the dangerous fatal kill zone. The absolute last thing any responsible naval commander wants to do is actively place their highly trained crew directly in the line of fire. Naval warfare in this century is heavily defined by the cold calculation of acceptable risk and the ruthless prioritization of military forces. When you carefully analyze all of these complex intersecting factors, the ultimate strategic decision becomes remarkably clear and unavoidable. The ultimate tactical reality of this situation is extremely clear to anyone who understands modern naval warfare and advanced area denial. Attempting to provide individual vessel escorting is a complete waste of American naval power that severely endangers our brave personnel. This harsh reality forces us to confront a much bigger geopolitical question that most politicians simply refuse to answer publicly today. We must consider if a massive conflict kicks off in the Strait tomorrow, whether the U.S. Navy should truly risk its dedicated sailors. It makes no sense to deploy billion-dollar destroyers to secure oil that is primarily destined for the massive markets of China and Europe. We must ask if it is finally time for those foreign nations to build their own fleets and actually protect their own vital energy supply. I want you to let me know your exact thoughts and strategic opinions down in the comment section below right now so we can debate this. I will personally review the responses and pin the most accurate tactical breakdown that truly grasps this complex geopolitical nightmare.